The eyes beneath the floor. The classroom smelled of old parchment and polished wooden pews, a scent that usually comforted 12-year-old Grace Turner. The stained glass windows cast vibrant patches of color across the floor as the Sunday school lesson continued. Sister Evelyn stood at the front, her voice steady as she recited the parable of the lost sheep, but Grace's mind was elsewhere. She had always been a quiet child, more observant than talkative, and today something wasn't right. A chill crept down her spine, and her fingers instinctively tightened around the worn edges of her illustrated Bible. It wasn't the words Sister Evelyn spoke or the soft shuffle of feet against the wooden floor that unnerved her. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Then she saw it. Near the far corner of the room, beneath the teacher's desk, was a floor grate. It was small, barely noticeable, just a cluster of old iron slats embedded into the floorboards. It might have been nothing, but as she absent-mindedly traced a finger over the book in her lap, she saw movement. A flicker. A shift in the shadows beneath the grate. Her breath hitched. Grace leaned forward ever so slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. The children beside her remained engrossed in their books, oblivious to the world outside their own thoughts. Then she saw them. A pair of wide, terrified eyes staring back at her from beneath the floor. Her blood ran cold. The eyes blinked, rapid and desperate, like someone trapped in a nightmare with no escape. They didn't belong to an animal. They were human. Grace's lips parted, but before she could react, something moved behind the eyes. A shadow. A hand. Then, in an instant, the eyes were yanked away, swallowed by the darkness beneath the floor. A sharp gasp escaped her, too loud. Heads turned. Grace. Sister Evelyn's gentle but firm voice cut through the silence. Is something wrong? Grace's gaze darted back to the grate. Nothing. Just blackness. Her stomach twisted painfully. She faltered. If she said what she saw, would they believe her? Sister Evelyn studied her with kind, expectant eyes. Grace swallowed. Nothing, sister. She forced her fingers to relax around her book. Sister Evelyn hesitated but nodded. All right, let's continue. The lesson resumed, but Grace barely heard it. She kept glancing at the grate, but the eyes never returned. Yet she knew what she saw. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that someone was down there. The warning. That evening, as Grace sat at the dinner table, she pushed her peas around her plate, barely touching her food. Across from her, her father, James Turner, a former detective turned security consultant, arched an eyebrow. Something on your mind, kiddo? He asked, his voice calm but perceptive. Grace hesitated. She had learned a long time ago that adults had a way of brushing off the things kids said. They'd smile, pat her head, and tell her she had a wild imagination. But her father was different. He listened. I saw something at church today, she admitted, voice quiet. Her mother, a school librarian, frowned slightly. What do you mean, sweetheart? Grace's fingers curled in her lap. There was someone under the floor. A beat of silence. Her father set his fork down. Under the floor. She nodded. There was a grate in the classroom. I saw someone's eyes. They were looking at me. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. And then, someone pulled them away. Her mother glanced at her father, concern etched into her features. Honey, you know how old that church is. It could have been a reflection. Or, it wasn't, Grace interrupted, her voice more firm than she expected. I know what I saw. Her father studied her. His gaze wasn't dismissive, it was calculating. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Did you tell anyone else? She shook her head. I didn't think they'd believe me. James ran a hand over his face. Street Augustines is one of the oldest buildings in town. If there's something under there, it's probably just old maintenance tunnels. Grace frowned. Then why were there people down there? Her father had no answer. That night, she lay awake, her mind replaying the image over and over. Those eyes. That fear, it wasn't just in her head. She had to do something. Secrets in the church. The next morning, Grace made up her mind. She had to see it again. When her mother dropped her off at Sunday school, Grace hesitated near the entrance before slipping away. Moving quietly through the hallway, she retraced her steps from yesterday, heart pounding in her chest. She reached the classroom door and slipped inside. Empty. She crouched near the grate, pulse hammering. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her ear against the cold metal. Silence. Then, faintly, so faintly she thought she imagined it, a whisper. Help. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. Someone was down there. She scrambled to her feet, heart racing. Before she could think about what to do next, a voice cut through the air behind her. You shouldn't be in here. She spun around. Father Malcolm stood in the doorway. He was a tall, lean man with piercing gray eyes and an unsettling stillness to him. He wasn't cruel, but something about him always made Grace uneasy. She swallowed hard. I was just. His gaze flickered to the grate, then back to her. Curiosity can be dangerous, he said, his voice calm but heavy with something unspoken. You should go back to class. Grace hesitated. Was it her imagination, or did Father Malcolm's expression seem almost warning? She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded and hurried past him, feeling his eyes on her back the whole way. As she reached the main hall, she clenched her fists. This wasn't over. The missing children. That night, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. She sat on her bed, flipping through her tablet, searching for anything about St. Augustine's history. If there was something beneath the church, she needed to know what. And then she found it. An old newspaper article. The headline made her stomach drop. Tu local chique ildorien, vanish, with auki a tracy, last ce in near St. Augustine's church. She scanned the article, her pulse racing. The children, both around her age, had disappeared nearly 6 years ago. They had been playing near the church one afternoon and were never seen again. No witnesses, no suspects. Just gone. Grace's stomach churned. She thought about the eyes under the grate, the whisper, and Father Malcolm's warning. This wasn't a coincidence. She needed to tell someone. She grabbed her phone and dialed. After 3 rings, her father's voice came through. Grace, what's wrong? She hesitated for only a moment. I think I know where the missing kids went. The unseen below. Grace's father, James Turner, was not the kind of man to dismiss his daughter's concerns lightly. As a former detective, his instincts had been honed over years of unraveling twisted truths hidden beneath layers of deception. But even he had to admit that this, his 12-year-old daughter claiming she had found a connection between missing children and the church's underbelly, was not something he had ever expected to hear. He sat in his dimly lit study, the soft glow from the desk lamp illuminating the creases of his face as he read over the old newspaper article Grace had sent him. His gut tightened. 2 children. Vanished. No traces. And the last known location. St. Augustine's church. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. He had lived long enough to know that disappearances didn't just happen without a reason. There was always something, always someone, pulling the strings. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind, filled with the quiet conviction that told him she had seen something real. A glance at the clock told him it was well past midnight, but sleep wasn't an option now. He turned back to his desk, where he had spread out every file, every report, every record he could dig up on St. Augustine's church. The building was ancient, dating back nearly 200 years. It had withstood fires, renovations, and even an earthquake decades ago. It had been a school once, an orphanage at another point, before finally becoming a church. And yet, in all that history, something stood out. Records from nearly 40 years ago showed that a basement had been constructed underneath the church. but there were no modern blueprints, no current records that indicated it even existed anymore. Had it been sealed? Hidden? If so, why? James leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Something was beneath that church, and his daughter had seen it, a plan in motion. The next morning, James made up his mind. He needed to go to St. Augustine's himself. He wasn't just a concerned parent, he had been a detective, and even though he no longer carried a badge, the instincts never left him. Grace sat across from him at the kitchen table, eyes wary yet determined. "So," she said, stirring her cereal absent-mindedly, "do you believe me now?" James sighed, setting his coffee down. "I believe that something is happening at St. Augustine's, but if I start digging too obviously, it might tip someone off. I need to be careful." Grace's brow furrowed, but she nodded. "You think someone's hiding it on purpose." Her father exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window where the early morning sun barely crept through the trees. "I think that if people have been disappearing near that church for years, and no one's asking questions, then someone's making sure of that." Her mother, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "James, you're not a cop anymore. If you go poking around, you could be putting yourself in danger." James gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I've handled worse." She wasn't convinced, but she knew arguing was pointless. That was the thing about James. Once he set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. He turned back to Grace. "But I need to know something. The person you saw under the floor, did they say anything?" Grace hesitated, recalling the voice that had barely reached her ears through the metal grate. It had been faint, desperate, and filled with something she didn't understand then. But now she did. "Yeah," she whispered. "They said, 'Help.'" James' jaw clenched. That was all he needed to hear. Into the church. Later that day, James found himself standing in the grand, arched doorway of St. Augustine's church, his gaze sweeping over the high ceilings, the stone walls, and the lingering scent of incense. It had been a long time since he had stepped inside a church, and even longer since he had looked at one without suspicion. Sister Evelyn was the first to greet him. She was a kind woman, always smiling, always warm, the kind of presence that put people at ease. But James wasn't here to be comforted. "Mr. Turner," she said, hands clasped in front of her, "it's good to see you. What brings you here?" James smiled politely, the kind of smile he had perfected over years of interrogations. "My daughter, Grace, mentioned something unusual. She said she saw a grate in one of the classrooms, and it got me thinking, does the church have a basement?" Sister Evelyn's expression remained neutral, but there was the slightest flicker in her eyes. "Oh, the building is quite old, and there are some crawl spaces and maintenance tunnels. But a basement? No, not that I'm aware of." James nodded slowly. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the confirmation he needed. Well, I suppose there's no harm in checking," she finally said. "Follow me." She led him through the hallway, past the rows of classrooms where children sat, their laughter and chatter echoing softly. When they reached Grace's Sunday school classroom, Sister Evelyn stepped aside, watching as James crouched down near the grate. It was old, rusted around the edges, but the slats were large enough to see through. He reached out, running his fingers along the metal. And then, very faintly, he heard it. A soft, barely there sound. Breathing. Someone was down there. James straightened, his mind racing. He couldn't react now, couldn't show that he had noticed anything. If there was someone keeping secrets here, then they were watching. Sister Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Find what you were looking for." James smiled. Not sure yet. He turned to leave, but before he stepped through the doorway, he caught sight of someone standing at the end of the hall. Father Malcolm. His eyes were locked onto James, unmoving, unreadable. And in that moment, James knew. This man wasn't just part of the church. He was part of the secret, the shadows in the dark. James didn't go home right away. Instead, he sat in his car just down the street, phone in hand, calling an old friend from his police days. When the call connected, the voice on the other end was sharp and alert. "Turner. Matt. I need a favor." A pause. "What kind of favor?" James took a breath. "I need to know if there's ever been an investigation into St. Augustine's Church. Any complaints, missing persons reports, anything." Another pause. Then Matt's voice came back, lower this time. "James, why are you asking about St. Augustine's?" A cold sensation crept down James' spine. "You know something." Matt sighed. "I know that every cop who's ever looked into that church either dropped the case or disappeared. And I know that if you're digging into it, you'd better be damn careful." James tightened his grip on the phone. "Something's going on there, Matt. My daughter saw someone under the floor, and I think they're still down there." A heavy silence followed. Then Matt's voice came through, grim and final. "Then you need to get them out, before it's too late." James ended the call, staring at the church in the distance. He wasn't just dealing with a hidden basement. He was dealing with something much, much darker. And if he didn't act fast, someone else was going to disappear. Forever. Beneath the veil, James Turner sat in the dim glow of his study, a tumbler of whiskey untouched beside him as he sifted through decades-old reports. His mind was a tangled web of questions, possibilities, and worst-case scenarios. Everything about St. Augustine's Church felt wrong. It wasn't just that Grace had seen someone beneath the floor. He had heard them. The barely there sound of breathing. The way Sister Evelyn hesitated. The way Father Malcolm watched him. It all led to one conclusion. Something was happening beneath that church. Something no one wanted uncovered. His fingers drummed against the wooden desk as he reviewed his notes. 2 children had vanished near the church 6 years ago. No suspects. No bodies. No leads. And yet, the police had closed the case in under a year. Why? The whiskey burned his throat as he swallowed, a slow exhale leaving his lips. He had spent years in law enforcement, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that cases like this didn't simply disappear. They were buried. And if someone had buried the truth about St. Augustine's, then it meant there was something worth hiding. James reached for his phone, dialing the one person who could get him access to the kind of files the public never saw. It rang twice before the voice on the other end answered, cautious but familiar. "Turner." "Matt," James greeted, keeping his voice level. "You get anything?" A long pause. "You're playing with fire, James." Wouldn't be the first time. Matt sighed, and James could hear the faint click of keys being tapped. "I dug through old case files. There's nothing official. No reports. No complaints. No paper trail. It's like St. Augustine's has been completely scrubbed from the system. If there was ever an investigation, it's gone now." James clenched his jaw. "You and I both know cases don't just disappear unless someone makes them disappear." Another pause. "Yeah," Matt admitted, his voice low. "And that's what worries me." James glanced at the church's blueprint spread out in front of him. His finger traced the outline of the *** old basement. ***, a space that was no longer marked on modern blueprints. "Matt, you ever hear anything about a basement at St. Augustine's?" Silence. Then a slow inhale. "You need to stop," Matt said quietly. "If you go poking around in places people want to keep hidden, you won't like what you find." James tightened his grip on the phone. "I don't have a choice. There's someone down there, Matt." Another long pause. Then, finally, Matt spoke. "Then you better hurry." A descent into darkness. The next evening, James found himself standing outside St. Augustine's Church, the towering stone structure casting an ominous shadow in the dim moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and candle wax, the faint hum of an evening service echoing from within. He wasn't going through the front doors. Instead, he made his way around the side of the church, where an old service entrance sat hidden beneath creeping ivy. It had taken him an hour of studying blueprints and surveying the church to confirm that this was the only possible way into the sealed basement. His fingers grazed the rusted handle, and with a sharp twist, he tested the lock. Old, brittle, easy. He pulled a set of tools from his jacket and got to work, the familiar rhythm of picking a lock soothing his nerves. Within seconds, a soft click echoed in the silence. The door creaked open. A gust of stale, damp air hit him immediately. The smell of mildew, earth, and something else, something almost metallic, lingered in the narrow passage. His pulse quickened. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for him to maneuver. The walls were made of old stone, and the deeper he went, the colder the air became. A faint dripping sound echoed through the space, the only indication that anything existed down here at all. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a wooden staircase leading downward. It looked ancient, warped with age, splintered in places, but still used. He could see faint footprints in the dust. Someone had been down here recently. James moved carefully, each step deliberate. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a larger room. The moment he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. Metal cots lined the walls, each one small, too small for an adult. The air turned thick with the weight of realization. These weren't just old storage rooms. They had been used. Recently. James' flashlight landed on something near the far wall. Chains, rusted but sturdy, bolted into the stone. His stomach twisted. Someone had been kept here. A faint sound echoed in the distance, a soft scuffling. Quick, nervous movement. James swung his light toward the source of the noise. A shadow flitted across the far end of the room. His heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was here. "Hey," he called, voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you, are you?" A sharp intake of breath. Then, footsteps. Running. James sprinted forward, rounding a corner just in time to see a small figure dart into a side tunnel. A child. His chest constricted. "Wait." He took off after them, dodging low-hanging pipes and crumbling stone as he chased the silhouette through the tunnels. The air was suffocatingly tight, and the further they ran, the darker it became. Then, abruptly, the child stopped. James skidded to a halt. The figure was trembling, barely a few feet away. He lifted his flashlight slowly, not wanting to startle them. The child turned, and James felt his heart nearly stop. It was a boy, no older than 9 or 10. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were ragged, his hands covered in dirt. But it was his eyes that shook James to his core, because he recognized them. They were the same eyes Grace had seen beneath the floor. James took a careful step forward. "You're safe now," he said, voice softer. "I'm going to get you out of here." The boy hesitated. His lips parted, his voice hoarse from disuse. "More," he whispered. James' brow furrowed. "More." The boy nodded, eyes darting toward the far end of the tunnel. James followed his gaze. And then he saw it. A second door. Old, heavy, reinforced. James' pulse thundered in his ears. Behind that door, something waited. Someone. His gut twisted with certainty. There were more children trapped in these tunnels, and someone had locked them inside. James turned back to the boy. "Who put you down here?" The boy's face paled. His body shook. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. James whipped around. The shadows at the far end of the tunnel shifted, and a figure stepped into the dim glow of his flashlight. Father Malcolm. His expression was unreadable. His hands were clasped in front of him in eerie calmness. "You shouldn't have come here, James," he murmured. James' breath turned sharp. Father Malcolm smiled, and in that moment, James knew. The priest wasn't alone. This went far deeper than he ever imagined. And now, they knew he had found them. Beneath the surface of faith, the underground chamber was silent, the air thick with dampness and decay. James Turner stood frozen, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows against the uneven stone walls. The small boy, frail and shaking, clung to his pant leg, his breath shallow, terrified. But James wasn't looking at him anymore. His focus was on Father Malcolm. The priest stood at the far end of the tunnel, hands folded, expression calm. But it wasn't the kind of calm that came with peace. No, it was the quiet control of a man who knew he was untouchable. James' pulse pounded. He had spent years staring into the eyes of criminals, men who had done terrible things and convinced themselves it was justified. Father Malcolm's eyes were no different. "You shouldn't have come here, James," the priest murmured, his voice smooth and deliberate, as if they were having a polite conversation in the chapel upstairs rather than in a hidden underground prison beneath a church. James' grip tightened around the small boy's wrist, pulling him slightly behind his leg. He needed to think fast. He was outnumbered. He didn't know how many people were lurking in these tunnels, but he could feel it. He was being watched. "You have no idea how much trouble you've just caused," Malcolm continued, his voice deceptively calm. "We could have handled this quietly." James clenched his jaw. Quietly. That word carried a weight he didn't want to unpack just yet. His mind worked quickly. He had no backup, no weapon drawn. The tunnel behind him was too narrow to run without risking an ambush. His only option was to play along for now. He straightened slightly, keeping his expression neutral. "Who else is down here?" His voice was even, steady, pushing for information. Father Malcolm's lips curled slightly, but he didn't answer. James' stomach twisted. The priest stepped forward. "You've gone digging where you don't belong. You had the good sense to leave law enforcement behind, Turner. Why throw that away for something that doesn't concern you?" James let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You have children locked beneath a church. That concerns me." The flickering light from James' flashlight cast an eerie glow over Malcolm's face, accentuating the sharp angles of his features. But his expression didn't change. "If you walk away now, James," the priest said smoothly, "I can forget this happened." James stiffened. Forget. The priest was offering him a way out, which meant only one thing. He wasn't planning on letting those kids go. James' jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. He had spent years interrogating criminals, men who thought they could talk their way out of their sins. Father Malcolm might have been wearing the robes of a man of faith, but James had seen the truth. He didn't need a badge to know he was looking at a predator. The boy beside him trembled, his small hand clutching James' jacket. He was terrified, not just of Malcolm, but of whatever had happened before this moment. James forced himself to exhale slowly. "I'm taking the boy," he said evenly, "and I'm not leaving without whoever else is behind that door." Malcolm smiled. "You think you have the power to demand anything." James didn't blink. "You're not getting away with this." A soft sigh escaped the priest's lips, as if James had disappointed him. "You really don't understand, do you?" His voice dropped slightly, a quiet edge of amusement creeping in. "You think this is about me? You think if you expose me, this all stops?" James didn't respond. Father Malcolm stepped closer. "This church has existed for generations, and so has the order." James' blood ran cold. Order. That wasn't just a casual choice of words. It meant something. A structure. A system. A network. He had been prepared to find a lone monster, a corrupt priest abusing his authority. But this wasn't just one man. This was organized. Malcolm's smile deepened at James' silence. "You've seen what's beneath this church, but you haven't even begun to understand." James forced himself to stay still, to keep his breathing steady. He needed to stay in control. "What do you want?" The priest tilted his head slightly. "I want you to leave." James glanced at the trembling boy. "And if I don't?" Malcolm's smile faded. "Then you won't leave at all." The escape. James' mind was moving fast. He had been trained for this: hostage negotiations, high-risk confrontations. But this wasn't a crime scene. This was a sanctuary of evil hidden in plain sight, and the man standing in front of him wasn't just a threat. He was a believer. And believers didn't back down. James didn't have a weapon drawn. He couldn't risk reaching for the knife he kept in his boot, not without alerting Malcolm that he was preparing to fight. He needed another way out. The child beside him flinched at every movement, his bony frame barely able to stand upright. How long had he been down here? How many more were there? James' gut tightened. He had to move now. "All right," James said, exhaling sharply. "You win." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting more resistance. James forced his shoulders to relax. "You said I could walk away. I will." He slowly stepped backward, his hands up, non-threatening. The priest studied him. James turned slightly, angling himself toward the narrow passage he had come through. And then he moved. James grabbed a rusted metal pipe that lined the stone wall, yanking it loose with a snapping sound that echoed through the tunnels. In one fluid motion, he swung. The pipe collided with Malcolm's ribs, knocking him backward. The priest staggered, his breath leaving him in a sharp exhale. James didn't stop. He grabbed the boy and ran. Behind him, Malcolm's voice echoed through the tunnels. "Jait them." James sprinted. His flashlight bobbed wildly, the tunnel walls blurring past him. The child stumbled, but James hoisted him into his arms, ignoring the burning pain in his ribs as he pushed forward. Footsteps behind him. More than one. James gritted his teeth. He could feel it. They were closing in. Then, a sliver of light. The stairs. James lunged. His boots hit the steps hard as he bounded upward, his lungs screaming. He shoved the boy ahead of him, gripping his tiny hand as they burst through the doorway, and slammed straight into another figure. James' stomach plummeted. Then, a voice. "Dad." James' eyes shot up. Grace. She was standing outside the church, her mother behind her, Matt at her side, and 3 armed police officers. James barely had time to react before the officers stormed past him, guns raised. Behind him, the footsteps skidded to a halt. James turned just in time to see Malcolm standing in the doorway, his expression darkening. It was over. For now. James tightened his grip on the child's hand and whispered, "You're safe." But in his gut, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The unholy network. The cold wind howled through the empty churchyard, rustling the dead leaves that clung stubbornly to the cobblestone pathway leading up to Street Augustine's. The night sky was a canvas of endless black, its silence interrupted only by the red and blue lights flashing across the walls of the old church. James Turner stood at the threshold of something far bigger than he had imagined. His fingers remained clenched around the small hand of the boy he had pulled from the underground tunnels. The child, thin, trembling, and wide-eyed, clung to him like he was the only thing tethering him to reality. Behind him, Father Malcolm stood motionless at the church doorway, his hands still clasped in that eerie, unwavering calm. Even as uniformed officers pushed past him, storming into the church's depths, he didn't resist. That was what made James uneasy. Men like Malcolm, men who were caught in the act, should have been panicked, should have fought, screamed, tried to flee. But Malcolm didn't. Instead, he merely watched James, his lips curling into something just short of a smirk. Like he had already won, James swallowed hard, his gut screaming that something was still wrong. The firm grip of an officer landed on Malcolm's arm. "Father Malcolm, you're under arrest," the cop stated, his voice steady but cautious. And still, no fight. Malcolm allowed himself to be pulled away, his head tilting slightly as he finally locked eyes with James. And in that moment, James knew this was far from over. "You think you understand what you've done," Malcolm murmured as they led him past. His voice was low, careful, but James heard every word. "You think pulling one child from the dark has stopped what's coming." James' jaw clenched. "What the hell are you talking about?" Malcolm smiled, an almost pitying thing. "We are everywhere, Detective." His voice was calm, filled with certainty. "The order does not die with one man." James' blood ran cold. The order. That word again. Not a single corrupt priest, not a lone madman abusing his power. A network, a system, a hidden web of people who had been doing this for years. James had suspected it before, but now it was confirmed. St. Augustine's was not the only church involved. Malcolm was nothing more than a piece of a much larger machine. And James had just set something in motion that he wasn't sure he could stop. As Malcolm was pushed into the back of a squad car, James exhaled sharply and turned his attention back to the boy. He crouched down, keeping his voice steady despite the growing unease twisting inside him. "What's your name, kid?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated. His lips were dry, cracked from what James assumed had been weeks, maybe months, of captivity. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "Liam." James nodded. "Liam, I'm going to take you somewhere safe, all right." The boy flinched at the word safe, like he had heard it before and had been betrayed. James' stomach twisted painfully. The child didn't believe him. And why would he? He had been taken from the light, hidden beneath the earth, trapped where no one could hear him scream. Who had told Liam he was safe before they had dragged him into those tunnels? James didn't know, but he was going to find out. The evidence they didn't expect. Inside the police station, the energy was electric. Officers moved hurriedly between desks, phones rang nonstop, and the hum of hurried conversation filled the air. James stood near the corner of the room, arms crossed, watching as Lisa Carter, a seasoned crime journalist, sat across from Liam, gently coaxing out whatever scraps of information the boy could give. It wasn't much. Liam didn't know how long he had been down there. He didn't remember where he had been taken from. He didn't even know his last name. And worst of all, he wasn't alone when he was taken. There were others, Liam whispered, voice so small it barely carried over the noise of the station. Lisa leaned in slightly. "How many?" Liam hesitated, his tiny fingers picking at the hem of his oversized, dirty sweater. "I don't know, but new ones came sometimes. And old ones left." James' breath caught in his throat. Left. The implication sat heavy in the air. Had they been moved? Had they escaped? Or had they been eliminated? Lisa's jaw tightened. "Do you remember anything about the men who took care of you?" Liam swallowed hard. Then, after a moment, he nodded. "There was a woman," he said softly. James frowned. "A woman?" Liam nodded again, his expression darkening. "She wore the same clothes as the sisters in the church, but she was mean." His voice trembled slightly. "She used to tell us we were lucky to be chosen." James stiffened. "Sister Evelyn." The kind, gentle Sunday school teacher who had smiled at him, who had led the children in prayer, who had acted like she had nothing to hide. Had she been involved this entire time? James exchanged a look with Lisa, who had clearly come to the same conclusion. If there were nuns involved, that meant this wasn't just limited to St. Augustine's. It went higher. And Liam was proof of it. Lisa turned to James, eyes sharp. "We need to take this public. If we expose St. Augustine's, we might be able to blow the whole thing open." James hesitated, glancing back toward Liam. "If we go public too soon, we might scare the others underground," he said carefully. "We need more." Lisa sighed. "Then we start digging. Because I guarantee you, this rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than we think." James nodded, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had spent his whole life chasing criminals. But this was something else. This wasn't about one church or one missing child or one corrupt priest. This was an entire system built beneath the very institution that people trusted most. And now, it was his job to burn it to the ground. The one still missing. The sun had barely risen when James' phone rang. He groggily reached for it, exhaustion weighing heavy on his bones. The voice on the other end was tense. "Turner, it's Matt." James sat up immediately. "What is it?" Matt hesitated. "You were right. Liam isn't the only one." James' blood ran cold. Matt continued. "After we pulled records from St. Augustine's, I ran a deeper search. Over the last 15 years, there have been quiet, unofficial transfers between churches across the state. Kids disappearing from shelters, orphanages, foster care programs, and all the paperwork. It's gone. Like they never existed." James felt the breath leave his lungs. "This goes way beyond just St. Augustine's," Matt said, his voice hard. "And Turner, if what I'm looking at is real." James swallowed. "What?" Matt's next words sent ice through his veins. "This isn't just happening here. It's happening everywhere." James' grip on the phone tightened. He had started by looking for one missing child. Now he had uncovered something far worse. And if they didn't stop it now, more children were going to vanish. Unmasking the shadows, the early morning sky was painted in dull shades of gray, the sun struggling to push through the thick cloud cover. James Turner sat in his car outside a rundown diner on the outskirts of town, his mind racing with everything Matt had told him the night before. It wasn't just St. Augustine's. The order wasn't limited to one church or even one town. It was a network spanning across states, hidden in plain sight under the guise of faith and charity. It had been right there the whole time. The quiet transfers, the missing children whose names had vanished from records, the orphanages that seemed to have no oversight. James had spent his entire career chasing criminals, but this wasn't just crime. This was systemic, organized, protected, and he had just ripped the lid off of it. Across the table, Lisa Carter sipped her black coffee, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through pages of classified documents and sealed case files on her laptop. She was a veteran journalist, used to dealing with corruption. But even she looked shaken. "There's too much to ignore," she muttered, shaking her head. "These records, some of these kids weren't just taken. They were erased." James rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "How far back does it go?" Lisa exhaled sharply. "Decades, maybe longer. The earliest cases I've found so far date back 30 years, and those are just the ones I can track. But if this thing has been operating the way I think it has, it could have been going on for generations." James' stomach churned. He thought of Liam. The boy had barely spoken since he had been pulled from the tunnels beneath St. Augustine's. He was alive, but how many others weren't? "We need to move fast," James muttered, tapping his fingers against the table. "If they know we're onto them, they're going to start erasing more evidence." Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her sharp gaze studying him carefully. "You know what's going to happen if we go public with this, right?" she finally said. James nodded grimly. "We're going to be targets." Lisa sighed, shutting her laptop. "We already are." She wasn't wrong. James had spent the last 24 hours tearing apart the veil that had kept this secret hidden. Now, he wasn't the only one looking into it, and he sure as hell wasn't the only one watching. A name no one was supposed to find. By the time James got back to the station, the weight of it all had settled deep in his chest. He barely had time to process before Matt waved him over, a grim look on his face. "I found something," Matt said quietly, leading him into his office and shutting the door behind them. He grabbed a folder from his desk and shoved it toward James. James flipped it open. His heart stopped. It was a photo of a man mid-60s, dressed in the unmistakable black and white robes of a high-ranking church official. The name beneath it made James' skin crawl. Bishop Edgar Holloway. James frowned. Who the hell is this? Matt's jaw tightened. The man who's been moving pieces behind the curtain. James' eyes narrowed. You're saying this guy is running the whole thing? Matt exhaled. Not just running it. Protecting it. James' grip on the folder tightened as Matt continued. This isn't just some corrupt priests selling kids into God knows what. Matt said, his voice low. It's way bigger than that. It's power. It's influence. It's money. Holloway has been the architect of this operation for years. Every time a church gets too much attention, he moves the people responsible to a new location. Every time a child disappears, he makes sure the case gets closed quietly. And every time someone asks too many questions, Matt hesitated. James' blood ran cold. They disappear too. Matt nodded. Exactly. James exhaled sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears. Malcolm had never been the real threat. He had just been a pawn. The real power, the real monster hiding behind the pulpit, was Edgar Holloway. And now that James knew his name, it was only a matter of time before Holloway knew his. Nowhere is safe. That night, James drove home with his fingers clenched around the steering wheel, his thoughts a tangled storm. He had to be smart, calculated. Holloway was dangerous, untouchable. But James wasn't stupid. He had spent years building cases, taking down criminals, putting men behind bars who thought they were invincible. Holloway would be no different. But as James pulled into his driveway, an icy chill crept down his spine. His front door was open. James' heart dropped. His hand flew to his gun as he shoved the car door open, moving quickly, silently. His house was dark. Too dark. His gut twisted violently. And then he heard it. A soft, trembling whimper. James moved. His steps were fast, controlled, his grip tight on his weapon as he swept through the house. No forced entry. No broken windows. Then, the living room. He froze. His wife, Anna, was standing near the couch, her face pale as a ghost. Grace was in her arms, sobbing. And across the room, pinned to the wall with a knife, was a note. James forced himself to breathe as he slowly approached. The paper was yellowed, old, like it had come from the pages of a church hymnal. There were only 4 words. Stay away from this. James felt his blood turn to ice. He turned to Anna, who was gripping Grace tightly, her breathing erratic. They were here, she whispered. James, they were in our house. James clenched his jaw, his entire body trembling with fury. This was a message. A warning. They had let his family live tonight, but only because they wanted him to know they could get to them whenever they wanted. James exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into a tight fist. Holloway had made his move. And now, James was going to make his. The final war begins. By sunrise, James was back at the station. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to wait for Holloway to strike again. He was going to bring the fight to him. We take this to the feds, James said firmly, slamming a file down on Matt's desk. We don't just expose Holloway. We expose the entire network. Lisa nodded. We need to be smart. If we push too hard, too fast, they'll go underground before we can get to them. James exhaled sharply. Then we start with the evidence we already have. We build a case so airtight, so damning, that they can't escape it. Lisa met his gaze. You think we can win this? James' expression hardened. They came for my family, he said, his voice like steel. I'm not giving them a chance to come back. Matt nodded. And just like that, the war began. The Order had spent decades hiding in the shadows. Now, James Turner was going to drag them into the light, and he wouldn't stop until every last one of them paid for what they had done. The hunt for Edgar Holloway had begun. And this time, the order was out of places to hide.